All right. I wanted to take a look at Ryan's code as a teachable moment, not because we're going to do anything at all that's associated with this semester, but just because it's a good teachable moment, because it includes a lot of things that I would be doing if I was in your position my first year working with R, but stuff that I wouldn't do anymore. So in a lot of ways, what I'm about to talk about is mostly a set of aesthetic things. And that set of aesthetic things isn't something that is fundamentally changing stuff, right? So, Ryan, your code works and you did a great job on these plots. I really like the work you did here. I did make a little tiny bit of change further down. We'll talk about that. Um, but I was going to go through sort of line by line and describe all of what was going on, but that dragged on for 36 minutes, which is just too much. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kind of show you yours. I'm going to show you how I changed that. And it's relatively small things. And then I'm going to kind of give a high level view of what's going on. So here's what you had. I'm just going to start up at the top. Here's what I've got. Get rid of that. So right off the bat, you've got this code that is really helpful, but not something that you really want to have in the script itself, right? The ideal version of the script, to my mind, and again, this is almost a quasi-aesthetic choice, but the aesthetics here matter because we're writing code not just for the computer, and your code works perfectly for the computer. We also want code for whoever's going to come up and read this script next. So your stuff, you put it into the computer, it's gonna work. It's gonna do stuff like reinstalling packages that are already installed on that machine. That's not the end of the world. Certainly not for a small scale project like this. If you're working for Wells Fargo, that's a much different story. But here, it's fine, right? It works. But just some things to make it easier for you to fix your code. If you pick this project up in a few months and you want to adjust it, you might go through your old script and kind of lose track of what means what. So these aesthetic changes help make it easier for our human brains to deal with this. So a lot of what I'm going to describe here is really just vestigial code, right? So when I was going through your script and modifying it with the hope of making a nice short video to make these points, I was going through line by line and talking through this stuff, and I was running code like this a lot, right? I would check what's the head of this. I was going into the results of this view data, which is an important part of the process of building up your script. But your final project, your final script, whatever you're handing off to your boss or to your intern, or that you've got running for a few months as part of a project, and then you get hired somewhere else, and so someone takes over your job and they've got to work through your old scripts. You want something that's going to be easy for someone to pick up and understand. And so things like getting rid of this vestigial code mean that there's just less stuff to see. All right. So this is stuff, like I said, it's totally something that I would do if I was in your position. But in my position with a decade of experience, I've changed my mind, or I've noticed or become aware of this stuff. So hopefully I can save you, get your R style more mature faster. So getting rid of vestigial code just means that there's less stuff. You also have vestigial libraries. So the code that you turned in doesn't actually use tmap. Another little minor thing. So I was having trouble even installing tmap. And this is a thing that happens a lot. Whether or not we're using someone else's code, someone else is maintaining that code, they have different versions of that code that was consistent with other libraries on their computer at different times, and it might not work on our computer for reasons like things like we've got SF 0.8-0, but we need 0.9.2. So there's like all these little things that make it difficult. This is, what's going on when you update your phone and it has problems. This is just the problem of living in a world where we're doing not just our own coding, but we're also using other people's code, and that code interacts with yet other people's code in sometimes unpredictable ways. So the less we have in our script, in that sense, the fewer moving parts, the fewer chances we have to run into some sort of a snag. So the big change I made up at the top is I commented out basically all of the libraries. And then I uncommented the ones that I definitely wanted to use. So tidyverse was in there. And another thing is I took these library calls that you had kind of peppered throughout your script, and I put them just up at the top as part of our setup. So my script is organized to start by clearing everything out, which I just like to do. It makes it easier for me to avoid making mistakes. I've got setup, in this case, loading in the libraries I need, and then setup in terms of importing the data I'm using. My next step is any processes that I'm doing. So the US COVID highest, which you've got far down in your script, I'm just putting up at the top, right? So I'm sort of doing all this stuff sets me up for all the code further down, right? In this case, all the code further down is just making plots. I really like that you've got this comment here to sort of separate the parts of your script to describe what's going on. This could probably use just that one little bit. New York State unemployment. Not a big deal, but a little bit of comment just to kind of show what's going on here. Unrate, it's kind of clear that we can figure out this is unemployment rate, but whatever, that's fine. A line here and there is not the end of the world. Have I frozen R? All right, whatever. So, long story short, I pulled out a bunch of vestigial code. I moved all the setup stuff to the top, and I did modify a little bit of stuff that, let's see, I can show you in the text editor. Let me turn, there we go. Let me turn syntax highlighting back on. So one example where I made a not important change, but I'm going to call it a significant change in terms of readability, is taking this call to plot, where you did a really nice job making a plot. I just am separating this across multiple lines, and RStudio does a nicer job of indenting. But basically what's going on here is I have changed nothing at all about your call to plot, except putting it across multiple lines just to make it a little bit easier to read. So I can see, all right, here's my X, here's my Y, here's my labels, here's my main label, here are my limits, here, I forget what, I think this is the size of the characters, here's, all this stuff. We got all that stuff in there. Not a substantive change, but does make it a little bit easier to read compared to having this all on one line, right? So if we don't have word wrap set, which is the default in RStudio, we end up having to scroll all the way to the right. Let's see, will this work? I should have just forced stop, but whatever. Long story short, your code works. It's great. I really like it. I really like the plots that you've got. This is basically an aesthetic set of changes that I'm making. And I'll upload this modified script into Blackboard so you can just see. It's not big. It's not fundamentally changing the logic as the computer sees it, but it is making it a little bit easier to read, right? So it's kind of a style thing. Hopefully this is useful for the rest of you. Also, just kind of the style point, avoiding that vestigial code. The one other thing where I did make a semi-substantive change, well, two semi-substantive changes. One is I changed your plot about the 5 highest states from total cases. where you're getting California at the top because California is just the most populous state. I changed this to cases per 100,000 because we're probably more interested in not how big is a state, but how dangerous is a state. So there, the percentage matters more than the total. Don't worry about that for the project, right? The project, total cases is fine. You made a plot, you showed some competence, that's great. And then this geom segment, I made some changes. So I fiddled around with this. This was kind of fun, changing xn to 0. Really made a weird outcome. So I'd encourage you to go through and fiddle with this. And then in this case, I think I made the y end not the max of the total cases, but just total cases. So that'll be by state, and I think this I set to 0, and that did the trick there to get you something closer to what I think you were after. That said, you can check out the code yourself. You'll see what I'm talking about there. Cool. I'll close there. 11 minutes is still, maybe more time than this point warrants. But, 11 minutes now will hopefully save you hours of debugging time in the future by just better organizing your code. Like I said, not the end of the world. Great job on this. I'm really happy with what you got. But just something to take forward with you into the future. One last lesson, one freebie for fall 2020.